Joining us now on Practical 365 is Thomas Nauheim. Hi, Thomas. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into things, I know you've been doing some tech talks and stuff like that lately, but do you want to tell us, for those that don't know, a little bit about you and what you do day to day?
Yeah, my name is Thomas Nauheim. I'm a cybersecurity architect at glueckkanja, and my focus is around the topics identity security. So everything related to Microsoft Entra. And one of my research topics over the last years was regarding tokens.
Yeah.
Tokens is something that is really essential because everyone is using them, even they don't know it.
Yeah.
And it becomes more and more a topic from a security perspective. And I'm doing for the community research work and writing blog posts and giving conference and community sessions about it. And I had a great pleasure last year at Tech in Texas to talk about this topic. Yeah, that was.
So it's an interesting, but it's also quite a scary topic. And I suppose trying to compromise identity has been around for a long time, right? I mean, if I think about before my career started in the late 90s, I remember being told that the university that I worked at, one of my first roles, that the IT director used to expose NFS to the internet in the early 90s to share almost like his personal website of things he'd share with colleagues at other universities. Now, obviously, that's long been bad practice, but trying to compromise identity, false login pages, it used to be quite targeted. I remember once the webmail login page, Squirrel Mail, if you're familiar with it, was we had a custom login page. Someone had replicated that, even taken the graphics, still hosted on our servers, and got a fake login page to obviously collect credentials and spammed, a lot of the users to try and collect their accounts so they could be accessed. But that's going back, 17, 18 years, so that was quite a targeted attack back then.
Yeah.
But I've seen yours and other folks' sessions and seen stuff myself, and it's quite easy for this to be sort of mass produced, especially when you've got Entra ID as almost a single point of entry to an organization. So what have you seen change since people have moved to the cloud that's changed the behaviors of attackers and also made it more difficult to secure things?
So if we make a comparison between the world of protecting cloud identities and on-prem, I guess my strong statement is here we have a couple of more built-in capabilities to protect identities.
Yeah.
And if we see the most trending attack methods, especially for initial access attacks, it's still really interesting that they are still the old tactics, right? Techniques. So still brute forcing, trying to gain the passwords. And in the cloud world, we have the capabilities about strong authentication methods, and not only strong authentication methods, we can use passwordless and having phishing resistant authentication. And out there, phishing attacks to gain user credentials is one of the most popular identity compromise tactics. And I think to protect them in the cloud is much easier than on-prem, because in on-prem, having really 100% passwordless environment, having things like conditional access, that is some technologies that we don't have on-prem. Yeah. But in the end, if I make a comparison between cloud and on-prem, we had the time in Active Directory when pass the hash has a big topic, right? And there was also not the need to compromise the credentials directly, more about getting the tickets and replay them on the other device. And similar to people have believed with all the cloud security by default, we don't have something similar in the cloud environment, but there's also artifacts after the authentication, and to gain or steal those artifacts is still in the interest of the attacker, because then you don't need to compromise the user or the credentials. You steal cookies, the tokens, and then you gain also access to the resources. And I think that's still the same story that we had the years before, but with other opportunities to protect our users and also for detection, which is much easier compared to what we have seen in the on-prem.
And these aren't necessarily difficult attacks to perform, I suppose, if you break down the steps, because you could simulate that, I suppose, relatively easily if you were to sit in front of a computer and get the cookies, get the monitor using the developer tools, what's passed over on the request, and then use curl or something similar to construct a request the same way, right? But with strong authentication, are Microsoft doing a lot to mitigate against that kind of attack? And I'm not saying they're specifically susceptible to it, because it applies to Facebook, Reddit, almost any of the normal sort of consumer websites that use cookies and tokens to log in. It's almost the basics of, I guess, web scraping, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we take a look, and that is not Entra specific, it's about the authentication protocols that are in the game. We need to consider two important things. So first of all, if we have something like phishing resistant authentication methods, so we are using Windows Hello, FIDO2, all the AITM, attacker in the middle scenarios can be mitigated quite easy, right? Having really a good authentication method. And it's also really more user-friendly because nobody likes passwords, but I don't like passwords, so I'm a big fan of a passwordless world. And when we're talking about the token theft, we have a strong issue that there's no, by default, bounding the token artifacts to the device. And Microsoft has adopted some security design for the most critical token artifact, the primary refresh token that exists as single sign-on on the OS level. So this is bounded to the device, to the cryptographic provider, the TPM on Windows or the secure enclave on macOS. But we don't have the same approach in general for other token artifacts. There's a RFC to bring also this device-bound cryptographic security to the other tokens, and Microsoft started with the feature around token protection to bring that to their identity provider, Microsoft Entra, but it's really limited from the supported scenarios. But that would be the goal, the holy solution to make it really hard for attackers to replay tokens, because if they are only valid on a device that has been issued, then it would be super secure or really a strong binding.
Now, I'm aware that people have been doing this since it was almost a all or nothing scenario, right? And things have obviously changed over the years. But I've seen successful phishing attacks where what they've done is they've used users in that tenant or known contacts of the user, where it's sharing a document using SharePoint, sharing features. And then the user at the other end clicks the document, clicks a link in it, and then that takes them to accept an application, which then is installed for the user in the tenant, which some people listening to this are going to go, well, that should never work. But it does in a lot of tenants. Older tenants where it's just been set that way, to start with, people who have loosened security, not tightened it up, I suppose, to the bare minimum. In those kind of cases, I've seen that they're almost trying to get as many accounts as possible, because there was no further action on the one that I saw. There was 2 applications installed, and they were effectively to use the SharePoint API to then go further, but then no access after that. A flurry of access that looked like a script, and then they moved on. What's the end goal then with attacks like that?
So when we're talking about token theft of replay, before we talked about more about the user and the tokens that they have on the device. But every application server, cloud application that is using modern authentication has a concept called delegated permission. And you give the application, for example, the consent, and that is the right wording, to get access to your Microsoft 365 data, for example, on behalf of your account. And it's a little bit outside of the security controls that we have in place, because our user with device compliance, strong authentication already satisfy all our security controls. And now we trust this resource that they are able to use the permissions to have the interaction with Microsoft Graph to collect data on behalf of you. And I totally agree. There are a lot of tenants out there without any restriction what are authorized or valid applications that are allowed to be consented and integrated to your tenant. And without having an approval flow, without having a restriction on that, it's quite easy for an attacker, not having an attacker in the middle scenario with phishing on the traditional way, more about bringing their own suspicious application to the tenant and then act as a resource on behalf of the user access. That is quite risky.
And because for several years there's been the capability to only allow like trusted publishers, define what permissions can be given by the user.
Yeah.
But if you've not got those in place, then I suppose part of it is understanding that the simplicity of these attacks, where an invoice is received legitimately from someone that you deal with. You open the PDF and it's click here for more info, and the app might say, you know, finance Sage app or something like that. It can't, because it's hosted on a Microsoft site. It's hard to if you've allowed this to happen in the first place, I suppose, then it's not something that you probably made your users aware of as to being a risk. And even an educated user is likely to sort of follow that flow where they've went, I trust this person, I trust the document. It's a link in a document to find more info. It's on a Microsoft site, and then nothing happens to them after that point because the credentials are then used out of band, I suppose, aren't they?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think when we're talking about some malicious apps, malicious resources that we access, of course, there's a couple of things that we can do in the mitigation by a good security posture. And it's also sometimes a tough question if you don't like to, or do you block everything? Because when we block, for example, everything regarding consent, and the people like to use a cloud application, and you have the opportunity to sign up with Microsoft Entra or using a local account, and they will be blocked by using the Entra ID account. What they are doing, hey, I use my local account by the service provider and using the same password that I have for my Entra ID user, because that is how people would decide to pick up their password. That is also not a good solution. So it is really important to have also monitoring on this one. So what are the activities to cloud applications, to cloud resources? Defender for Cloud Apps plays in the security stack an important role in that one, so that you have visibility by ingested data from the client. What are the cloud apps that are accessed by the user? And there's also the app governance, which is now available for all E5 customers. And that gives you transparency about what are the API permissions that will be used by an application, and also trigger alerts if they are increased exfiltration of data. So there's a couple of ways to identify potential risk.
Now, privileged access. Now, this has always been a problem, hasn't it? And you know, as a consultant, I know that there's all sorts of different ways that organizations of, especially enterprises, have thought long and hard, consulted colleagues in industry, got advice from organizations, and still end up doing it, you know, some different ways. You know, there's a lot of accepted reasonable ways out there, but how is best to go about that? You know, in a modern world.
Yeah, so there are some golden rules from the. So I'm also a good old Active Directory admin guy, so I know what we did in the past when it comes to securing privilege access in AD. And there has been all the ESAE, Red Forest approach, and all this stuff that maybe some of you also know. One of the most important things is even we have some features like privilege identity management to have just-in-time access. It's very important that you're not using your regular work account for privilege access. So having separated accounts is still super essential, even for cloud administration. And also having a separated account from your on-prem management. So I would strongly avoid to synchronize on-prem accounts to the cloud and using them to keep the world splitted. For the blast radius separation. And when we're talking about token theft, like before, having privileged access from your work device where you browsing the web, having access to email, and also testing scripts or something like that. I would strongly recommend to even separate your account and devices from your stuff that you are doing for productivity workloads. So there's this concept about the poor privileged admin workstation, and it's still valid in the cloud world, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's more than separate user accounts or accessing on Citrix or virtual machine elsewhere. It's some physical separation, because I suppose even if you are diligent in your work life, then you could be browsing to find information from Ghana or something like that, something to help you do your job, and come across something nefarious. And I've seen that scenario where we've employed somebody, they've got such a career history, what's gone on here? And it's one of those things where you hear the story and think it could happen to anybody, where they weren't, as they said, doing anything nefarious, but something happened, it compromised the environment, they were fired, and obviously have struggled to get back to where they were. So, this was someone that we were employing to do desktop support duties, who had been a senior network administrator. And you think, that could be me, if I'm not lucky. I don't think I went away and built a privileged access, a privileged administrative workstation after that. But I probably should have. Learn from other people's mistakes,
Yeah, and it's really important to say there are some levels between having everything on your productive device, on, for example, your MacBook, and having a full hardened PAW. Because giving everyone in the IT a separated physical device, it's also a question about how it scale and will be adoption and the acceptance by the admins. But I think when we're talking about really high privileged users like the global admin, like the domain admin, I hope you have not 100 of them in your organization. So for the most critical one, a physical admin workstation would be suitable, in my opinion. And then the question is, what do you do with all other admins? And then there could be some solution in the middle, like having a full separated Azure Virtual Desktop environment that will be split. Yeah. It's still not an admin workstation, but it's maybe a better security approach than doing everything on a local device. So I think there's risk. Some maturity levels between that one.
Yeah. So what people would call like a jump host or similar, where you must go onto that to then be able to do something modern, I suppose, if it's as your virtual desktop, and potentially got some benefits, obviously, as well. But yeah, I don't think it's a difficult question, really, is it? Because if you were to ask people in the organization, the user base, and say, do you feel like, do you feel comfortable that the IT admins are browsing the web, reading their email, and they could also jump into your files and your email and the confidential HR information if they wanted to, or if they went to the wrong website, then somebody else could. Then how many people would be like, yeah, that's fine. Who cares if they get compromised? I think they'd probably be in some ways appalled that was the case, because there'd surely be an assumption from employees around the business that they're IT experts, taking all the standard precautions. It's not a perk to have a second machine that's for less serious work, or it might not need to be such a powerful machine to do a lot of the administrative tasks either.
Yeah, and it's, I think for me, as someone that has some experience as a global admin and a domain admin back in the good old days, for me it feels more safe to have it on a separated device. So I'm really sure that on this device I have the full access, and I'm running with the gun always in my hand, and there's risk in these scenarios. So in the end of the day, I think it's really fair to say high privilege, fully separated. And you need the separation because there are some different security policies. So, of course, it makes sense that you are not having an active mail-like box on your admin account. But of course, you should be in a position to receive notifications. So there should be a redirect to your regular account. So yeah, there are things to consider, but I think there are some valid designs out there. They are really suitable. Yeah. So
get yourself some pause. Or pause for thought. I'm sure there's a million and one stupid things I could say. So I'll stop right there. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today, Thomas.
Thank you.
I'm sure people will see you at various conferences throughout the world. But do you want to just let us know how to find you on socials and your blog, just so I can read a little bit more about the stuff that you do?
Yeah, so would be great. Also, the session that we talk about, the token theft session, is also available as a webinar on demand. So strongly recommend to have a look at that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, feel free to follow me on social media. And if you have any questions, would be open for...
Cool. You'll find the links either in the blog post for the podcast, or if you're watching on YouTube, then it should be just below the video there. Thanks again, Thomas, and speak soon.